Hi everyone. I've been asked to provide a brief review of the concept of top-down and bottom-up history. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So, um, in week 3 of African American history, we covered this question. And the question is a really big question. It's sort of almost a metaphysical question. The question is, how does change occur? How is it that as history moves forward through time, change does occur, right? Obviously, things are really different today than they were, for example, in the time of Ona Judge, who you're reading about in the book Never Caught. So what we talked about was that there are sort of different ways of thinking about this from a historical point of view. Some ways of studying the past are more of what we would call top-down history, and others are bottom-up history. Top-down history tends to be the kind of history that I think you're most familiar with coming into college, and really that most people are most familiar with. It tends to focus on great men in history. So my example is from the TikTok, which I made for all of you. So you can watch that TikTok on your own time. Oh, okay. I'm cracking myself up here. But anyway, another great way of thinking about top-down history, what is top-down history, is that top-down history tends to be the kind of history that focuses on so-called great men. So people who you've heard of, who I've heard of, people like George Washington, maybe people like Martin Luther King Jr. I included this picture on this slide here. So this is a picture of the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I mean, just take a look at the picture. I see a bunch of older men. Most of them are white. Most of them, I can tell you, are very rich. They're congressmen, they're senators. You have President Lyndon Johnson here, and of course, Dr. King here. So that is certainly one way of studying the past. Who was in charge? What did they think? What did they do? We know a lot about George Washington, right? What he thought and did. We know a lot about Martha Washington, what she thought and did. So that's top-down history. Another way of studying the past is bottom-up history. Because the truth of the matter is, no matter what George Washington wanted, or Martha Washington thought, or Lyndon Baines Johnson wanted or thought, it did matter what ordinary people were doing and what they were thinking. So another way of studying the past is the bottom-up history, and that tends to focus on ordinary people, people like probably my grandparents, my great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, probably your grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, and really just what their lives were like and what they were doing. So those sort of 99% of people who maybe aren't famous today, maybe weren't famous in their lifetimes, but still were making history, just leading their ordinary lives. I have some examples here. Rosa Parks is a great example of someone who sort of crossed that boundary from being an ordinary person to, within her own lifetime, becoming so famous that she still was just a regular person, but she made this very brave decision, right? She was like, no, I'm not going to give my seat up on this bus. And that was a really important moment in the civil rights movement. Well, what about Claudette Colvin? Oh, you've never heard of her maybe, or maybe you hadn't till my class, but this is someone who also made really a very similar decision, but we haven't heard of her. Why? You can Google it for yourselves. Just suffice to say, this is another example of an ordinary person making a choice, and a choice that did make a difference. Um, so, another example might be the Double V for Victory campaign that we talked about earlier in our class. Um, the sort of top-down approach to studying the World War II era would say, when was Pearl Harbor bombed? When did the US decide to get involved in World War II? How did that happen? But a more bottom-up approach might be, what was it like for those African Americans who were serving their country in a segregated military during World War II? All this talk about freedom and liberty for all, how did that affect African Americans? It's a really great question. It's a good way to think about some of the early days of the civil rights movement. And we in our class read about the Double V for Victory movement during World War II. And here's another example, Ona Judge, I would say. Here she is. We don't have any pictures of Ona Judge. We don't really know what she looked like. So one good way to portray her is just in a silhouette. So studying that issue, I'm sorry, here's my cat. Okay, stop interrupting us. Anyway, so studying the past, you can certainly study a top-down approach, which focuses on the elites, the sort of richest, most powerful people, what they were doing, how change was occurring through them or not occurring, because quite often elites don't want change to occur. They're good, right? They're happy with how things are. But another way of studying the past is to study bottom-up history, just ordinary people living their lives and sometimes affecting great change through choices they make. So I hope that helps. Thanks for asking the question. You all take care.